Welcome to St. Mark's. My name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here. Hey, look, for those of you watching us online, we're glad you are. But for the first time in 62 weeks, I'm looking at faces. The whole face, and it's pretty cool. So we've tried to be patient, and March the 8th, 2020. Can you believe that? Was the last time this room was like it is now, with unmasked faces and no ropes and markers and all of that sort of thing. Someone said to me between the services this morning, I think Chris Tomlin, was it Tomlin who did the version of Amazing Grace, My Chains Are Gone? He said, maybe we should have sung today, My Mask Is Gone. So maybe we'll squeeze our musicians and maybe they'll do that one of these days. Well, let's talk about rules. Some of you are probably thinking, oh, let's not. But would it make you a little more comfortable if I said maybe we could talk about standards and regulations, guidelines and bylaws? I mean, we're all accustomed to having to figure out every day, what are the limitations and the borders and the boundaries? And without those, life would kind of be a free fall. It could be an agreement where you have signed a membership covenant. And when that happens, we say yes to certain things, and we say we promise to protect the integrity of the organization that we're joining, and we'll hold up the standards of membership, and in return for that, we'll get some benefits, and you know how that goes. Could be a group like Costco or Sam's Club. Maybe it's a gym membership, possibly a club or an organization, even a church. Sometimes we invite people to make a pledge of allegiance, to stand behind the future of the mission and the vision of the local church. These documents are sometimes called bylaws, but whatever you call them, they are used to define what the benefits and requirements of membership are. Some of you live in neighborhoods that require you to put your name on a covenant. It's usually governed or controlled by an HOA. Most people will sign an assortment of contracts over their lifetime, and these are always involving promises and commitments. And typically they come with a guarantee or some type of warranty that requires a signature. Every now and then we have to employ the assistance of an attorney so that there can be some tailor-made agreements so that everybody on both sides of the fence get the benefits. Our local, state, and federal governments, they stay busy. Sometimes it's hard to figure it out, but they stay pretty busy hammering out policies and legislation. And all of those are designed to put some boundaries around us and keep our community safe and pretty much impartial for as many of us as possible. Churches and religious organizations, we have covenant agreements, and sometimes those promises are called creeds. It's what we believe, or maybe it's a statement of faith, or once in a while it's even called a confession. We confess that this is what we believe. But it spells out the core beliefs and convictions. I'm not talking about things like dress codes and music styles. I'm talking about things which are the non-negotiables. These are the hills that we would die on if we had to. Now, fortunately, sports are governed by a number of rules, and those boundaries typically keep the game safe and controlled. But come on, y'all, some of the rules are just plain dumb. Look at this image. This is Tiger Woods, Rory McIlroy, and Justin Thomas. Now, that looks like a casual afternoon stroll down a golf course for these three gentlemen, a friendly game of golf, no big deal. Yes, kind of depends. This was not exactly a friendly game of golf. This was 2019, the PGA Championship. These three guys were playing together. Maybe I don't know what they're talking about, maybe what they had for dinner last night. How's life back at home? What kind of rental car are you using this week? But if by chance one or more of these guys starts to talk about golf strategy, or how far do you think it is to the green, or there's a water hazard, if you're over to the left side of the fairway, or which club are you going to use, anything that could influence the play of the game, that's a no-no. And players are penalized 2 strokes. Sometimes it seems a little bit extreme, but when you think about it, what if your playing partner or your opponent gives you some bad advice? And then it gets you in trouble, and that conversation might go downhill pretty fast. As most of you know, or at least you men, in the National Football League, if a player catches a pass or intercepts a pass, then he has to put both of his feet down inside the boundaries of the playing field for it to be a legal catch. In high school and college, just 1 foot. Go figure that one. Here's one for you baseball fans. It's rule number 6. If the catcher fails to catch the ball on the third strike and first base is open, or if there are 2 outs, regardless of whether first base is occupied, then the batter becomes a runner. Even though he struck out, he becomes a runner. Now, most of the time, that little rule doesn't make any difference at all. The catcher picks up the ball if he drops it, tags the hitter, turn runner, or tosses the ball to the first baseman who steps on first base, and the hitter is out. But on rare occasions, if the catcher drops the third strike and he's not able to retrieve the ball in time to make sure that the runner is tagged out at first, that can be a problem. As the Brooklyn Dodgers found out in the 1941 World Series, they were playing against the Yankees. The Yankee hitter missed his third strike. The catcher misfielded the ball. And so he races off to first base. The inning was extended. The Yankees scored 4 runs, won the game, and went on to win the World Series. Now, what we'll never know is what might have happened had that catcher been able to successfully get a hold of the third strike. End of the game, end of the inning, maybe end of the game. What a crazy random rule. Our last rule, or one last rule in professional golf is Rule 6-6 that says this. Each player is responsible for the correctness of the score recorded on each hole on his or her scorecard. If a player signs a card in which the score for any hole is lower than his actual performance, he is disqualified from the competition. Now, this almost never happens, and it's very rarely enforced. However, in the 1968 Masters, when Roberto Di Vincenzo, when he signed his scorecard, and it was incorrect, he was immediately disqualified. And the tournament championship was given to a professional named Bob Golby. Just for the record, anybody want to take a wild guess at what the winning purse was in 1968? It was a whopping $20,000. A few weeks ago in this year's Masters, the winning purse was $2,070,000. In 2016, the PGA finally said, just 5 years ago, okay, let's fix Rule 6-6. And so now if you inadvertently or accidentally sign a scorecard that's not accurate, you're assessed a 2-stroke penalty, and at least you are able to avoid the punishment of disqualification. You know, sometimes do you ever wonder whatever happened to the good old-fashioned handshake when we made promises and we signed deals that way and it was all done? But then again, if you think, what would the sports world be like if without 3 strikes and 4 downs, and in a professional golf tournament you can't take mulligans, and so plus, there are fouls and penalties and protective equipment, safety equipment that players are encouraged and sometimes mandated to wear. Can you imagine if you get in your car when this service is over and you're driving down the streets or highways of this community and there are no speed limit signs, no road signs, no seatbelt requirements, no penalty for the violators? Some of you know what it's like, so we've got passwords. Y'all got passwords? We got passwords. We got lots of passwords. And they'll say, have a lot of passwords. Make it strong. Have a strong password for computers and smartphones and private information. And so there are boundaries, and these are boundaries and values established, and they say, this will just make your life better if you'll stay within the boundaries. In fact, sometimes we'll even preach that from the stage. We'll say, here's a boundary, simplify. Simplify your life. Or declutter whenever you can. Live within your means. Avoid unnecessary debt like it's the plague. Live in moderation. Avoid comparison with your family or friends. Make healthy food choices. Wear sunscreen. You know how those things go. They're pretty simple, but they're boundaries. But sometimes living within those safe boundaries and respecting each other lawfully and officially, that can be hard. And Jesus knew about that. He grew up in an era of time. His public ministry was consumed in a world of government restrictions and religious boundaries. There were over 600 religious laws. Let me show you just 2 moments in the public ministry of Jesus. First, we'll read from Luke chapter 6. On a Sabbath day, a man with a deformed right hand was in the synagogue while Jesus was teaching. The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, they watched Jesus closely. Now, these were the keepers of the creeds. But Jesus knew their thoughts, so he said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." It's one of my favorite parts of the story because Jesus said, I could take you backstage and we could do a little secret thing, but no, I'm going to put it right out here in front. So the man came forward. Then Jesus said to his critics, "I have a question for you. Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save a life or destroy it?" He looked around at them one by one. That had to be intimidating. And then said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand and it was restored. At this, the enemies of Jesus were wild with rage and began to discuss what to do with him. And then here's a passage over in Matthew chapter 15. Some Pharisees and teachers of the law, once again, these are the rules keepers, they came to Jesus from Jerusalem. They asked him, "Why don't your followers obey the unwritten laws which have been handed down to us? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Jesus answered, "And why do you refuse to obey God's commands so that you can follow your own teachings? You rejected what God said for the sake of your own rules. You are hypocrites. Isaiah the prophet was right when he said about you, 'These people show honor to me with words, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship to me of me is worthless. The things they teach are nothing but human rules.'" Let's talk about human rules. Now, these passages and others have been obviously translated into our contemporary culture. And so churches, and some of you attended churches like that, and I've had quite a few conversations with people after the first service about this, churches that have created a whole bunch of restrictions that never did really stack up against the Bible. In fact, some of you grew up with one or more of those traditions that kind of had you bound up. For example, some of you might have grown up in a church and there was only one acceptable translation of the Bible. That would be the 1611 King James Version. Maybe you were restricted by dress codes, like a woman had to wear a dress if she's in public, and men could never wear a pair of shorts outside their house. Cultural indulgences, like movies and secular music and dancing, were sometimes strictly prohibited, including the use of alcohol in any form and in any amount. I don't know if some of you attended a church when you were told that, well, somebody might say, well, there was a lot of drinking of wine in the Bible, and you might have gone to a church when the deacons were very quick to point out, yeah, but it wasn't really wine, it was unfermented grape juice. Now, let me tell you something. When Jesus went to a wedding once and they ran out of wine, and he took some water and he transformed it into wine, and the host said, "Man, this is the best wine we've ever had." Now, let me tell you something. If you believe that's unfermented, I might can get you a job selling ice to a bunch of Eskimos. It wasn't unfermented. But maybe you grew up in a church when there were rules about tattoos and facial hair and acceptable dress codes, dating restrictions. How about this one? Limit your use of the internet. Now, some of those churches about a year ago had to eat crow because we went into COVID lockdown last March and the church services were restricted to what? The internet, of all things. Music, dancing, alcohol, premarital. Let me tell you. So I talked to a person this morning and he said, in the church where I grew up, you couldn't play cards because cards then would tempt you to start listening to secular music, and the secular music would tempt you to start dancing, and the dancing would tempt you to start drinking alcohol, and the alcohol would tempt you to start having premarital sex. So now if you can figure out how to put all that together. Secular music was rejected, and some of the musical instruments that are mentioned in the Bible were just ruled out, like horns and trumpets and stringed instruments, like the harp and the lyre, which was a forerunner of the guitar. Percussion instruments are ruled out in a lot of places, drums and cymbals. And this is an ancient form of rhythm that they used a long time ago, and these are called clappers. And somebody just kept beat. And this kind of instrument is sometimes ruled out. Everybody wanted to have a voice and a vote about what kind of music God likes and what's acceptable and what's not. Let me give you a test to see how you do. This is a pop test. Y'all like those? I love pop tests when I'm up here. All right, watch. Here we go. I want you to listen to a couple of audios. Listen. All right, you got that? Was that a sax? Sounded like a sax to me. All right, listen to this one.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see.
All right, now do you recognize that original tune? What is it? House of the Rising Sun. Okay, all right, so which one of those two songs is a Christian song? No, not both. I mean, what makes a song a Christian song? The what? The lyrics. The first song had no lyrics. It's just a tune. And tunes can't be Christian or non-Christian or whatever. It's the lyrics. You know what sometimes happens in rules and boundaries and all this kind of thing that just some things that frustrate me about these things. Now, Susan was in the first service, so she'd tell you, my list is real short. Thank goodness for that. But stupid rules. I mean, a stupid rule can sometimes I just want to hold my head. I struggle with stupid rules. Now, my tendency is to be unusually compliant when it comes to rules. I'm just a rules follower. Was when I was a little kid. Regulations and posted guidelines, no problem for me. So about a year ago when the masks became a mandate, that was no problem for me. I'm all about it. My MO in life is comply and conform. That's not hard. Be courteous and respectful. Excuse me, I'm sorry, would you like to go ahead of me? I respect handicapped parking spaces. I silence my phone when appropriate. I refrain from using the horn on my car. I just don't do the horn. In fact, about once a month, I blow my horn just to make sure it still works. Now, some of y'all used your horn more times this past week than I've used in the 11 years since I've owned that car. The horn, don't get me going down. The horn's a stupid way to, anyway. But you know the drill. Last Sunday, we attended our church with our daughter and son-in-law and grandkids for Mother's Day. By the way, Joanne did a great job last week. Yes. Look, it's about an hour drive. That's all it is. So we gave ourselves plenty of time. We built in one bathroom break. That always happens. Now, am I going to be late for a church service? It's not going to happen. We were 10 minutes early. Would I ever be rude and be sending or responding to text messages while some guy's preaching? Are you kidding me? No, sir. Now, I'm not going to whisper and take naps during the sermon. I am disgustingly compliant. What can I say? So then last fall, maybe it was November, when the YMCA reopened after it was a long stretch of COVID lockdown, it made perfect sense to me when the YMCA put up a big banner outside and it says the governor's mandates that we will honor requiring masks for entry and you have to wear the mask the whole time you're moving around the facility. I was all in. But then shortly after they opened, about 3 weeks after the opening, then they posted a new sign with a new rule and it said you have to wear your mask in every area of the Y at all times. With the exception if you're in the shower or in the swimming pool. Even while you're working out. Hey, look, if I was into lifting weights, so you go over here and you do a lift and then you take a break and you come over here, that's no problem. You get time to catch your breath. I get that. I mean, you can look at me and tell I'm not spending a lot of time in the weight room. That makes sense. But when I'm doing an intense cardio workout, I need to seriously be able to breathe. Oxygen. I need the oxygen. Some of you have actually seen me at the Y working out, so you know what I'm talking about. If you spend an hour on an elliptical machine, you need to be able to breathe some air. But they said, now you've got to wear a mask. Now, my first reaction, I thought it was a stupid rule. But I'm an easygoing guy. So I talked to a couple of people over there. I know everybody over there. And, and I said, do y'all have any idea what might happen to my lungs if I spend a passionate hour breathing almost no oxygen and spending an hour breathing CO2, carbon dioxide? No, we don't know. So Do you know how they responded to that honest question? They gave me this gator mask. You know how those work? Put it over your head and stuff. I've got an orange one and a blue one. They gave me two of them. And you know what they said? Just wear the gator. And then they said, this gator is so porous that you ought to be fine. Like, and I'm thinking, well, if it's so porous, then is it giving me any COVID protection at all? So did I refuse to comply? No, sir. I've been wearing the gator. I'm Mr. Compliant. Susan will attest to it. You can ask her sometime. My predisposition is to always be a rules keeper. Drive the speed limit, monitor my intake of red meat, allow other drivers to cut in front of me, wear a gator at the Y. That's it. I complied. Obviously, I've not died from CO2 poisoning. But what we don't know yet, you see, is that there might be some long-term effects. I mean, there could be some brain damage. Some of y'all thinking, too late. Too late for that, Bob. But as of this Friday, I'm talking 2 days ago, the executive director, who's a member of our church, sent me a text Friday afternoon, May 14th. Take a look at this. It's the new rule. If you are vaccinated, you do not have to wear the porous gator while you're on the elliptical machine breathing CO2. You can now breathe oxygen. I think I'll save this gator, though. You never know, right? But there are times when it's all I can do. How am I going to maintain my sanity in the presence of these impractical, crazy rules? Every now and then, I can be like that little. Do you know about the little 4-year-old? And his dad was trying to get him. He was standing up in a chair. His dad was trying to get him to sit down in the chair. This little kid, he was not going to budge. So a second time, his dad said, "Son, you need to sit down and you need to do it now." But still the kid remained standing. This kid was he was spirited with noncompliance. Finally, his father went over, grabbed him by the shoulders, picked him up and forced him down in the chair and said, "Now, son, sit there." And the little boy folded his arms in defiance and said, "I might be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside." Anyway, maybe I do that occasionally, but most of the time I'm a cooperative keeper of the rules. Back when I was in college, guys' hairstyles were getting longer. Facial hair was almost non-existent back in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s. But in my freshman year in college, some upperclassman told me, he said, it's bad luck if you shave during the week of midterms and finals. Now, I'm not a 4-leaf clover type guy. I'm not looking for luck or anything, but why take the chance, right? So I'm going with the no shaving plan during final exams. I just followed the deal. All through college, 4 years in seminary. Now, I wasn't trying to create an insurrection or anything. I wasn't saying anything to anybody. But I thought, why risk it? You never know. Little luck. I remember when I was an undergraduate student at Catawba College, I came home during the final exam week to get something to get mom's cooking and to see my girlfriend, who I'm married to now. And so I'm sitting at the dinner table with my unshaven face. It was not all that noticeable because I don't have that rough a beard or anything. So when I sat down at the table, my dad had placed a razor right beside my fork. And you know what he said? Just study harder and go shave. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden." These religious leaders in Jesus' day, they came up with so much extra stuff. Now remember, we started with 10, and then they added 603 more rules and barriers and boundaries, and every one of those was intended to exclude somebody. They were exclusionary. So Jesus spent a good bit of time and energy in the face of this religious hypocrisy, and he was always trying to dismantle it. Jesus said, "You Pharisees and teachers of the law of Moses are in for trouble. You're nothing but show-offs. You lock people out." You see there? You're locking people out of the kingdom with your rules. So here at SMC, we decided decades ago that we never wanted to be guilty of that. We never wanted to create a problem for somebody to experience Jesus by bouncing against a barrier that we had created at some point along the way that didn't make sense and was not biblical. So Bob, what are you saying? We don't have any rules. We chunk the rules. We eliminate all the traditions. We walk away from generations of well-meaning rituals and practices and customs. Of course we don't do that. But there's a constant need for the people of God to keep their eyes and hearts open, to make sure that they're paying attention to the unimportant and the unnecessary things that might somehow or another build a barrier and shut people out that God wants to reach. What would it say? What would it say about our generation if Jesus said this about us? So practice and obey what the people at SMC tell you to do, but don't follow their example because they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands. You lock people out of the kingdom of God. And you know how you can tell the difference between those kind of boundaries and God's boundaries? Very simple. Watch this. Every single time, 100% of the time. God's prescribed boundaries are all about two things: love, protection. Protection, love. That's it. You take the 10 Commandments, for example. Every single one designed to make life work better. Love, protection. For instance, number 9, don't lie about people. Well, how hard is that? I mean, it's hard to do, but not hard to understand. Just don't hurt people by telling a bunch of untruth things about them. Don't try to gain leverage against somebody by being untruthful. Number 10, don't covet or wish that you had something that somebody else has. Come on, Bob, is there anything wrong really with wishing I had a new car like my best friend, or that we could take a vacation to the islands like our friends did, or that we could renovate the kitchen, or maybe I'd like to have an iPhone 27 or whatever that number is? You know how it is on Christmas morning. there is happiness all over. Somebody's got this super awesome Barbie action playhouse, and it's just, she's having the time of her life until her friend down the street gets something bigger and better. And what are the next words out of that kid's mouth? It's not fair. This is not fair. Coveting is not just wanting a new kitchen. We all have wish lists. Coveting is, why did they get what's on my wish list? I'd be happier if I could trade places. Don't bet on it. James, the half brother of Jesus, was spot on. Look at what he said. Do you know where your fights and arguments come from? They come from the selfish desires that war within you. You want things, but you do not have them. So you are jealous of other people, but you still cannot get what you want. So you argue and fight. God's commandments and requirements are always about two things: protection, protect us because he loves us. Number 6 says don't destroy and devalue life. Don't destroy life before or after birth. Number 7, don't ever dishonor and violate your marriage vows, your promises. Number 5, respect parental wisdom and authority. Always protection and because I love you. These are no-brainers. Well, what about the first 4 commandments, Bob? They're about our relationship with God, and these are essential because when we disrespect God and when we abuse his authority, it just cannot possibly lead to anything good. For example, don't have any other gods before me. That's what he says. Just don't place anything or anybody in the top spot of your life. If you're going to have somebody in the driver's seat, make sure it's God. Let me show you. This will blow some of you away. Let me show you a practical issue, and it's very practical for today, that stretches back 4,000 years, and this is an example of how attentive God is when it comes to loving and protecting us. Our ancient ancestors 4,000 years ago, they were just trying to live the best life they could. They were trying to live the fullest life they could, but they were living in a very primitive culture. Those people did not have a clue about germs and viruses and bacteria and so God said, let me give you some boundaries, and these will not compute for you right now, but just do it because it's the loving thing to do. Watch this. God said, Now, this is in the book, by the way. This is in Deuteronomy 23. You must have a designated area outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. Each of you must have a spade as a part of your equipment. Whenever you relieve yourself, dig a hole with the spade and cover the excrement. The Lord your God moves around in your camp to protect you. There it is. That makes sense to everybody? Now, these oldest manuscripts stretch back to the 7th century BC. So then, hit the fast forward button 2,100 years. Now we're in the middle of the 14th century, the mid-1300s. We're right at the heart of the Middle Ages, and a devastating global pandemic swept across Europe. It was called Black Death. 1/3 of the population in all of Europe was destroyed. More than 20 million people died. And they eventually discovered, now watch this, that disease was spread by rats and fleas who lived in the sewer. Now, they didn't have Dr. Fauci. So they had no clue about germs or bacteria or how diseases get passed from one person to another. They didn't have a lot to do with personal hygiene. So it was a setup for disaster. And so God said, I have an idea. Just do this, and it will be for your good. Actually, germs, watch this now, germs and bacteria would not be discovered and detected for hundreds of years. 1864, when Louis Pasteur discovered how germs work and bacteria and so. Now think about this. This church, St. Mark's Church, was 9 years old before anybody had ever heard of a germ or a virus. Crazy. God was thousands of years ago. You see, God was already giving us some protective warnings. Now, in our day, modern sanitation and public health practices have essentially eliminated the horrible disease of Black Death. What did God say? What did he say? Get you a shovel and go outside the community and do your thing. But get away for protection and because I love you. So, us Gentiles, non-Jews, we're not bound by Jewish practices, thank goodness. I mean, we're not. So that's why some of you enjoyed your bacon biscuit this morning. Because you can eat pork because you're not Jewish. Makes sense. We don't have to deal with those dietary restrictions any longer. Y'all bring coffee in this room? Isn't that amazing? Some of y'all bring a cell phone in here. Imagine that. Of course, you wouldn't be texting. Right? Be reading your Bible app. Yeah, that's what they tell. Every time I see somebody, I say, I noticed you were texting. No, Bob, I wasn't texting. I was reading my Bible app. Watch this. Andy Stanley. Y'all know him? In one of his sermons, I like this. He said, for years, my approach to the Christian life was like a game of Simon Says, except my game was called Jesus Says. Jesus says, read the Bible. Jesus says, pray often. Jesus says, love your hard to love neighbor. The problem for me, Andy says, is I was constantly feeling like I was disqualified from the game. And then eventually I figured out that I sort of liked being eliminated because I didn't have to play the game anymore. I would be out of the game and I was thinking to myself, well, I'm out because I blew it and I sinned. So instead of getting back in the game, I think I'll just spend a few more weeks sinning because I'm out of the game anyway. Then he said, every once in a while, I meet people who have never played the Jesus Says game. They're sinners, bad people. And so I was thinking, you really need to learn to play the Jesus Says game and then you won't be bad anymore. But they never wanted to play. They said, that's a stupid game. And there was a part of me that wanted to be like them. They just do whatever they want to do and they never feel guilty because they never played the Jesus Says game. But then somebody would say, Andy, you need to go talk to those people who don't believe in Jesus and tell them to play the game. But I was never sure whether I wanted to tell them or not. I guess I never liked to play the game myself. Every time I read that, I wonder if the reason why Jesus didn't play the game that the religious people in his day demanded that he play, well, they didn't just disqualify him. When they decided that they didn't like the way Jesus played the religious game, They just killed him. How many of you are familiar with the announcement? You're watching your favorite team on TV, football. And they pause and they say the previous play is under further review. I bet y'all didn't know that Jesus was the first one to do that. One Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat dinner in the home of a leader of the Pharisees, and the people were watching him closely. There was a man there whose arm and legs were swollen. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in religious law, is it permitted in the law to heal people on the Sabbath day or not? When they refused to answer, Jesus touched the sick man and healed him and sent him away. Then Jesus turned to them and said, which of you doesn't work on the Sabbath? If your son falls into a pit on the Sabbath, don't you rush to get him out? Again, they could not answer. Maybe you remember the guy. You remember the guy that was suspended on one of the crosses beside Jesus? He had never played the Jesus Says game in his life. He reached out to Jesus and he said, sir, I don't know who you are. I don't know how this works. But I don't have time to play the game. Can you get me into heaven? Here was a man who was just minutes away from eternity. Most likely he was a hardened, hard-nosed criminal. He's got no way to fix anything in his life. He's done. And what does Jesus say to him? I'll win the game for you. John chapter 5. Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, were brought to Jesus. One of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, Jesus told him, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. Instantly, the man was healed. He rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. But this miracle happened on the Sabbath, so the Jewish leaders objected. And what did they say? Whoop! This play is under further review. They said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry a sleeping mat. But the man replied, the man who healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. Who said such a thing as that, they demanded. The man told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had healed him. So the Jewish leaders began harassing Jesus for breaking the Sabbath rules, and they tried all the harder to find a way to kill him. What Jesus was saying is, look, my Father has prescribed some boundaries that are written in the law, the 10, and they're all about love and protection. But what you have done is come up with a whole bunch of other things. And then it was like Jesus was pleading with these rules keepers and saying, is there nothing that trumps your rules? Even a man like this who seriously needs some medical intervention. But these people were so devoted to playing the religious game and protecting their traditions. Now watch. That they would even violate one of the 10, number 6, about murder. They would even violate that one and assassinate the man who had helped the handicapped guy on the Sabbath. That's what religion does. It's the Jesus Says game. And sometimes the really important requirements and demands get left behind, the priorities. Maybe that's what Paul was driving at in Galatians chapter 5. Christ has freed us so that we may enjoy the benefits of freedom. Now make sure that you stay free and don't get tied up again in slavery to the law. That would be the man-made stuff. People were drawn to Jesus like a magnet. But the insiders were so uncomfortable with him because he had the audacity to break their hundreds-year-old traditions. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, he saw a woman who had been crippled by an evil spirit. She had been bent double for 18 years and was unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and touched her, and instantly she could stand straight. But the leader in charge of the synagogue was indignant that Jesus had healed her on the Sabbath day. Now watch this. There are 6 days of the week for working, he said to the crowd. You come on those days if you want some medical attention. Don't come on the Sabbath. But Jesus replied, you hypocrites. Each of you works on the Sabbath day. Don't you untie your ox or your donkey from its stall on the Sabbath and lead it out for water? This dear woman has been held in bondage for 18 years. Isn't it right that she be released even on the Sabbath? You've heard me say this many times, SMC. Jesus did not come to start a new religion. He was not here to teach us how to follow the rules. But it seems like that our human tendency is to default and just slip right back into rules keeping, because that's the way that it makes the world more simple for us. That way we can do the competition stuff and we can see who can keep the rules the best and who can climb to the highest rung on the performance ladder. And so our world gets so focused on, so who's got the most stuff, the best stuff, the highest score, the lowest score, the biggest office, the most square feet in their house, the best win-loss ratio, the most impressive resume. It's a world where competition just kind of owns us, just rules us. Maybe that's why we struggle to believe that God's goodness can be reduced to freedom. Free. This is why so many Jesus followers, even in our day, are so uncomfortable with grace. Several months ago, you want me to show you how? Some of you, I know that. Because several months ago after a service, I was doing the grace thing. I do it a lot. I was singing the grace tune that day, and a guy met me after the service out there in the lobby, and he was nice, but he said, aren't you concerned that you might oversell grace? And I just smiled and said, I'm taking my chances. And then he said, well, what if you get to heaven someday and God says, you missed out on grace. You missed it. You missed on grace. And I said, well, if God ever says that to me, what I'll know is I'm not in heaven. I won't be in heaven because I'm either going to be in or I'm going to be out based on grace, grace, grace. Ephesians 2:9 says, for you have been saved by grace. Now, I know some of you struggle to believe that a man hanging on a cross who's guilty of a capital crime, he's being executed. I know some of you are troubled by the fact that this man is given a full pardon in the 11th hour, in the 59th minute of his life. How can that be? That guy can't play the game. He'll never play the game. He can't start stacking up a whole bunch of good chips in his corner. He can't turn his resume around. So how's he going to wind up in heaven? Only one way. The scandalous grace of God demonstrated on the cross, Romans 5. God showed how much he loved us by having Christ die for us, even though we were sinful. But there's more. Now that God has accepted us because of the sacrifice of his own son, we will not be subject to God's anger. Even when we were God's enemies, he made peace with us. And now that we are at peace with God, we will be saved by the life of his son. God sent his son to make peace with us. Me too. We were completely helpless to save ourselves. So you know what our options were? Just one. There was a day when every single one of us, we were in the same boat. The same boat that remorseful dude hanging on the cross was in. Same place. Grace or nothing. Grace or nothing. But then guess what happened? Almost always happens. Over the next 25 or 30, 50 years in the life of the church starts to gain some momentum in the first century. Paul and his companions are traveling all over the world, planting churches and preaching the message of the cross and amazing grace. And you know what happens? It didn't take long. And the church started to drift back into religious traditions and restrictions, rules and boundaries, because that way we can keep the boundaries are made to keep the good people in and the not so good people out on the ragged edge. And you want to know why? Because religion believes that those ragged edge people will only tarnish what we've got going on in here. And guess who determines who the ragged people are? for example. When the gospel started spreading beyond the Jewish people into the Gentile world, that would be us, non-Jews, the Gentiles were told that, well, now, I know you want to follow Christ, but before you follow Christ, you got to become Jew. You got to start practicing all the Jewish traditions. You got to fulfill all the Jewish rites and the customs. Whenever it was not all that big a deal to have to give up ham and sausage on your breakfast sandwich. But let me tell you something. When they got out the sharp knives, and they gathered all the men in the new member class and took them out back for circumcision, some of those Gentile dudes said, hey, I don't think so. I'm not going out back with y'all. The Jewish tradition was that a baby boy was circumcised on the 8th day of his life. It's a special ceremony. Well, that's tough enough, but let me tell you something. If you're 28 or 48 or 88, can you blame some of those men for saying, what? Well, let me think about that. Can you imagine you open up a church website and it announces that if you want to follow Jesus, first of all, you've got to submit yourself to the whack-a-mole ceremony. Now, I can understand why, the knife was a real serious, a boundary, a stumbling block in the first 50 years of the Christian movement. You think maybe that's why Paul was a little whacked out? And that's not a pun, by the way. He said, when we place our faith in Christ Jesus, look at this. There is no benefit in being circumcised or being uncircumcised. I love this. Was he ticked off? He said, I just wish that those troublemakers who want to mutilate you by circumcision would just mutilate themselves. I like that man, Paul, don't y'all? Sometimes when life gets hard and confusing, we want to just drift back into the rules. There's something comforting and safe about the rules. So it's beginning to make sense to some of you that for decades around here, we've just been calling grace scandalous. Scandalous. Jesus said, you hypocrites. The prophet Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. Can you imagine the tens of thousands of people that travel up and down St. Mark's Church Road every single week, and they make the turn down there on Garden Road, and they see this big facility sitting here on the corner, and how many of those people just shake their heads, and they just roll their eyes, and they lump us in with every other church that they've ever experienced in their lifetime, and they're thinking, just another big collection of hypocrisy. But what if we're not that kind of church? Never let it be said that we kept our influence for the real Jesus away from people because of our foolishness. So one more time. Jesus went into the synagogue, noticed a man with a deformed hand. Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the deformed hand, come and stand in front of everyone. Then he turned to his critics and asked, does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath? Or is it a day for doing evil? In other words, this play is under further review. Is this a day to save a life or destroy it? But they wouldn't answer. He looked around at them. He was angry and deeply saddened by their hard hearts. Then he said to the man, hold out your hand. And it was restored. At once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus. They just kept tripping over tradition. So let it be said, SMC, not on our watch. Not now. Not ever. All right. I'm glad you're here. Look, I was so early this morning. We have our pre-service meeting like at 8:20, and I said, well, we'll have can Jarm come out and he'll close us up, say a prayer and stuff. And they said, Jarm's in Las Vegas. And I said, he's where? Yeah, he's in Las Vegas. And I said, well, what's he doing? And they said, well, you know, it's Las Vegas. It's like, you can't say. Let's see, it's 9:08. Y'all think he's up by now? Actually, he's out there with the family. They're going to have a blast this week. One of his daughters lives in Las Vegas, and they're going to hang out and have a good time. And I hope it's restorative this week. But so it's 9:08. So Jarmy, if you're watching this, don't you gamble with any of your tithe money. I'm just going to tell you right now. Let's stand for a closing prayer. God, your loving protection is sometimes it's overwhelming to us. And so a long time ago, even though people didn't understand, they were motivated to and inspired to write down certain things that were handed down and passed down and handed down. And now here we are, we're reading the Word, we're reading the book, and we're saying, wow, God's just all about love and protection. Thank you, God, for protecting us and for not allowing us to be foolish without boundary, without knowledge, without a passion for getting life right, for loving your church, the Big C Church, and for helping us to devote ourselves and recommit to getting it right for Jesus' sake. And you agree with the prayer and said, see ya. Have a good week.